Forget everything you think you know about heroic last stands in medieval castles. The reality was far more brutal, far more calculated, and disturbingly legal. When the castle walls finally broke, it wasn't a scene of valiant combat. It was the beginning of a legalized atrocity. For days the air would fill with fire, screams, and the clang of steel, not against armor, but against doors and treasure chests. Hollywood sells us tales of honor, but the medieval world operated on a system that incentivized terror. The fall of a castle wasn't a noble defeat, it was a state-sanctioned nightmare. At the heart of this horror was a cold, hard legal principle. Jus Praedae, the right of plunder. This wasn't some obscure footnote in a dusty law book. It was the fundamental rule of siege warfare. The law was simple and terrifying. If a fortress or town refused to surrender and was taken by assault, everything and everyone inside became the legal property of the attackers. Buildings, goods, livestock, and yes, the people themselves. This wasn't a war crime. It was the expected, legally protected outcome of resistance. This created a deadly dilemma for the defenders. The commander of a garrison was trapped. If he surrendered too early, he faced accusations of cowardice and could be executed by his own lord for failing in his duty. But if he held out for too long, past the point of no return, he triggered Jus Praedae, condemning everyone under his protection to total destruction. Every day of a siege was a gamble with thousands of lives, weighing the faint hope of reinforcements against the certainty of what would happen if the walls fell before they arrived. So, violence wasn't just random savagery. It was a weaponized legal mechanism, a tool of psychological warfare. Every castle that was brutally sacked served as a blood-soaked warning to every other fortress in the region. The message was clear. Negotiate now, before our siege engines are in place, before our ladders touch your walls. Surrender, or you and everyone you know will die. For the commander inside, it was a constant, agonizing calculation. How much longer could the food last? How many more stones could the walls withstand? Would help arrive before the law turned against them? Imagine the scene. After 90 days of siege, starvation is gnawing at the defenders. The commander, his face gaunt, knows that help isn't coming. He orders a white flag raised. This isn't a surrender, not yet. It's a request to parley. The attacking general rides forward and lays out the terms, cold and simple. Open your gates by dawn, and your lives will be spared. The commander doesn't trust the promise. He knows the character of the men outside, but the cries of starving children inside the walls win the argument. With a heavy heart, he agrees. As the sun rises, the great gates creak open. For a fleeting moment, there is a tense, fragile calm as the surrender begins. But then, the system turns on itself. The first wave of soldiers enters, their eyes scanning for loot. The tension is electric. Someone discovers a cellar full of wine, and whatever fragile discipline existed evaporates in an instant. Drunken soldiers, fueled by months of frustration and greed, begin to reinterpret the situation. They convince themselves that the surrender wasn't formal, that a few defenders resisted, that this counts as an assault. And with that flimsy excuse, they activate Jus Praedae. Suddenly, murder and looting become legally protected acts. The attacking commander, standing by, does nothing to stop it. He can't, and frankly, the law doesn't require him to. In fact, it's his soldiers' legal right. What follows is the sack, a process that, by military custom, lasted for a horrifyingly specific 72 hours. This wasn't pure chaos, it was structured, methodical plunder. Specialized teams were dispatched with cold efficiency, one to the treasury, one to the armory, another to the chapel to strip it of its gold and silver, and another to the noble quarters for jewels and fine cloth. The surrendered soldiers, who had been promised their lives, were often cut down where they stood. The combination of alcohol, the rage of a long siege, and total legal immunity unleashed what was known as furor militum, the soldiers' fury. Civilians who had sought refuge behind the castle walls now found themselves reclassified as plunder. The chroniclers of the time often hid the worst of it behind euphemisms like the usual outrages. But the reality was systemic sexual violence on a massive scale. Women and girls were targeted as spoils of war. Churches and sanctuaries, which should have been safe havens, were ignored. Priests were murdered at their altars. As one historian put it, sacred ground meant nothing to men with swords and legal permission. The very concept of sanctuary dissolved in the face of legally sanctioned greed. After the initial frenzy of looting and violence, a grim economic logic takes hold. On the second day, the sorting begins. The surviving population is assessed not for their humanity, but for their market value. Nobles, wealthy merchants, and their families are identified and separated. They are valuable alive, to be held for a hefty ransom. Skilled artisans, blacksmiths, weavers, masons are also set aside. They will be enslaved and sold for their labor. The rest? The elderly, the sick, the poor, the laborers with no special skills. They are deemed worthless. They are a drain on resources and are simply left to die from their wounds or from starvation. Imagine a grandmother holding her granddaughter's hand. In this cold calculus, the girl has maybe 20 years of labor value. The grandmother has none. The bond is broken by the economics of war. The enslaved survivors were then marched off, destined for markets across Europe, the Mediterranean, and even North Africa. It was a brutal journey. Records suggest that perhaps 70% survived the march. The rest died along the way. This wasn't an unfortunate byproduct of war. It was the engine of its economy. The entire system of medieval warfare, protected by laws like Jus Praedae, fed a vast international market of ransom and forced labor, a system that profited the very nobles and kings who waged these wars. 6 months later, what remains? The castle stands as a hollow, silent ruin. The town that surrounded it is a wasteland of charred timbers and collapsed homes. Of the 3,000 residents who sought shelter, perhaps 400 scattered survivors remain, living as refugees. This population collapse wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate strategy of demographic destruction. The land itself is rendered useless. Food stores have been burned, wells have been poisoned, and the surrounding fields have been salted. The goal was to deny the enemy any ability to use the site again, to wipe it off the map not just physically, but as a functioning community. It would take 3 or 4 generations for the land to recover, if it ever did. Sometimes the conquerors would resettle it with their own people. Other times it was simply abandoned forever. Even more lasting was the cultural extinction. The conquerors brought a new language, new laws, new customs. Within 2 generations, the old songs, local traditions, and the very memory of what the community once was began to fade. The victors rewrote the history of the event, casting themselves as heroes. The castle remained a landmark, but the people who built it and the culture that filled its halls had vanished, their stories erased. It's crucial to understand that this system wasn't chaos. It was policy. And it worked. The horrific example made of one fallen castle ensured the swift surrender of 10 others. The terror was efficient. It made prolonged resistance a suicidal act, and it saved the attackers time, resources, and lives. The violence wasn't a breakdown of the medieval order, it was the order. The final lesson here is that real medieval warfare wasn't about glorious charges and heroic duels. It was about mathematical terror. A commander wasn't just a warrior, he was a risk manager, constantly calculating the precise moment when the law would turn from a shield into a sword aimed at his own people. The siege of this castle lasted 98 days. The fall took 3, but the consequences lasted for generations. The true horror of medieval warfare wasn't the violence itself. It was the chilling fact that everyone involved, from the king to the lowest foot soldier, knew that it was legal, that it was normal, and that it would happen again. The laws of war were never designed to protect the innocent. They were designed to terrorize them into submission. Thank you for watching. If this look into the darker side of history was interesting, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more. We'll see you next time.